All these types of things helped me think more critically about what I had ultimately get into. Um, Taking that neighborhood hat and thinking about how do you problem solve for those most in need, really at its core, that's what equity is and it's about. It's about thinking about what people need in order to be successful and trying to ensure that we dismantle the structural barriers that prevent and limit those successes. In some ways, I'm tailor made to work in government because I think about problem solving in terms of how are we going to effectuate better results for people? What is going to, we think about the pandemics that we are in of both race and COVID. We think about vaccine now distribution. We think about businesses that are hardest hit. Those businesses, those people of color that adversely affect people of color more. The disparities associated with healthcare and the lack of healthcare and health opportunity impact people of color and lower income residents more. Problem solving in those arenas, I think, is something that has become natural to me and something that I gravitate towards. So to your students, if you're thinking about equity and orientations around sort of diversity, inclusion, in many ways, hanging out with you and spending time with you is the perfect way for them to connect and plug into these types of things. That's what, the liberal arts-based education, particularly ethnic studies, gives us grounding and training in to be able to figure out how can we then try to work towards dismantling some of the structural barriers that are in place to people's success.
So I wanted to get into some of the practical things that you do like every day in your work. So what does that work look like on the ground? So if I was going to switch places with you and go through your job, maybe not, before pre-COVID, pre-COVID and post-COVID, what are your everyday tasks look like as an equity manager?
Well, it's interesting that you say pre-COVID and post-COVID, because in some ways, I think the way we, even as a city and in city government in particular, had to pivot to adjust to the reality of COVID and some of the adverse impacts of it, it's tailor-made for people like me in our office to intervene in ways that are going to help increase outcomes for people. So let's take a COVID example, if you don't mind. Ways in which we interact and try to ensure that we are reducing barriers for people in need, identifying them, which is important. We've created an equity matrix that it's an atlas, it's a map with GIS technology that we have mapped on our website, the city of San Antonio, and broken it down and scored places in the city based on our highest concentrations of racial segregation and highest concentrations of economic poverty. And based on these maps, we've got a color-coded index that you can look at and see where are targeted populations who are going to need the most help, who are going to need the most resources, right? What we can then do is overlay what we've got in terms of how we're thinking about responses. So in economic development, what we see is reductions and decreases in small businesses, particularly those owned by women and people of color. We see higher unemployment rates for persons of color. And so what do we do to intervene? Well, an office like mine recommends steering some resources towards thinking about what life is going to be like after COVID. How many folks are going to need new skills in the workplace, in the marketplace, to be more prepared for the jobs of the future? Many of the jobs aren't coming back. And so how do we then position people through training, through workforce development, through programs that are going to align with them potentially having more opportunities when we come out of this pandemic? So offices like mine, and through my work and my colleagues' work and interventions with folks like our folks in economic development, we then create and recommend policy that says, hey, let's spend a portion of these resources. I mean, the tune that we allocated towards workforce development was over $150 million, right? That's significant in the lives of helping people make sure that they get additional training. In housing, it looks like trying to ensure that we have protections against evictions, that we have protections for folks who are going to have trouble paying their rent or making their mortgage payments, right? Ensuring that we can plan and think through real policy changes that are going to improve the lives of people. That's what we try to do. And then the last thing I think I'll emphasize for you all is, how do we get people to connect with this idea? You've got to train people and get them to think about things differently. I often talk to people about equity, and I say equity is really often a critical thinking exercise. You have to think about distributions of resources and think about people. Equality-based approaches give everybody the same thing and they assume that everybody starts at the same place. We all know that we don't. And so if you are English as a second language learner, when you enter a classroom, you have different needs. If you come from a family that is a predominantly Spanish speaking family in the household, you know, you might have different needs when you walk into a learning environment. And so equity says, no, everybody doesn't start out at the same place, and they should need and have different things based on what they need to be successful. So it tries to fill in the gaps for some of the things that may be barriers to people's success.
Wonderful. Thank you for that explanation of your work. So I know that you've been doing some work with the Alamo colleges around equity and diversity, and they are now creating an office of equity and inclusion, I believe, for the Alamo colleges, which was part of the outcome of the trainings you did there. And so that's wonderful, and congratulations on that work. And so here at Our Lady of the Lake University, we've been in discussions about what that might look like for us. Recently, we noticed that none of that was in the strategic plan, and we don't have an office of equity and diversity. So what would be your advice for an institution like Our Lady of the Lake University that is in the heart of the West Side, that serves a predominantly Latinx student population, predominantly first gen population? So what is, where would you tell us to start, this work here at Our Lady of the Lake?
Very good question. You just gave some important indicators, some important demographic information that I want to just take a moment to center on. Number one, you said, I think you all's population is roughly 75% identifies as Hispanic or Latinx. You are located in an area of the city that, by virtue of redlining practices from the 30s and 40s, it predicts who lives in your community there. And so, because there were codified legal barriers and exclusions of people and their mobility where they could go live, we have pockets in this country of racial segregation all over the country. This was by design. I want people to understand that this is by design, right? And so what we have to do now, and what folks like your institution have to do, is think about that. Think about some of those root causes to identify ways in which we can then move forward. If you don't go back and look at some of the things that make you who you are, it's very difficult then to think about the process for moving forward. In you all's origin story is sort of this connection to the people in ways in which your education brand and modeling then is still can be connected to the people. If I'm giving advice to you all about thinking about making the case for why you should even focus on diversity, equity, inclusion in the first place, is I'm going to say this: it's an economic imperative that you do, number one. Um, Competition for talent and students demands it, number one. Number two, what those students are able to do with their lives afterwards also demands it. What they're able to come back and contribute it to you all as alums also affects the training, the education, the experience that they're going to have right there on the campus. If you've got 75% of your population that identifies as Hispanic or Latinx, but they don't see faculty that reflect the numbers of them that are matriculating through your campus, then you aren't modeling ways for them to think about and imagine what they can do for their lives, right? And you also then perhaps aren't teaching to them in with pedagogical deference in ways that connect with them in ways in which they can understand and be much more productive and more helpful. Um, the other thing I'll say is this: recognizing your students where they are requires people to think about it, to ask questions, to survey, to um, think deeply about them and what a true sense of community feels and represents to them. How do we create communities of belonging if we don't know anything about the communities that we're trying to represent? So I think that those things are significant in order for you all to be the best university that you can be. And I think usually an analysis of folks' policies and practices have to ensure that. That the other thing I'll say about this is this, and some reasons why Mexican American studies is important, why ethnic studies is important, why liberal arts is important. Um, we've got to have people who have some sense of how to connect with one another in order to promote change for everybody, in order to create the population that's going to go out there and make the substantial changes that are necessary for the betterment of our whole community. People have to be able to think and connect with people. It has to be something intrinsic about that connection that then is able to allow them to learn some things about place, about people, about migration, about immigration, about forced migration, about real contexts of slavery and slavery that still exists, in human sex trafficking. It's these types of things that are important that help round out the whole person. And offices that promote diversity, inclusion, and equity are the types of offices that can get us closer to those types of outcomes for our students.
Thank you for that. That was a wonderful explanation, and hopefully we can invite you to campus sometime to do some professional development or meet with students about your work. It would really be wonderful. Now we only have 15 minutes left in our program, so I
Okay.
wanted to open it up for questions. And so I always give Paola the first question, and so she can pick a question from the ones that she sees, or she can ask her own question. So, Paula, what's your question to start us off?
There we go. Sorry, I've been having a couple issues, but wow, there's so much information, and um, I'm just really happy that like we were able to make quite a couple of connections with, with the discussions about, oh, like after COVID, and really like the impacts that people are going on right now, with the movements, politically, but also financially, as a lot of people are going through harder poverty conditions. But I guess my question is, as a student right now, that is just, getting more involved in these type of conversation, and as you were saying, that it's very important to be able to connect with other people. I guess my question is, how what would be a better way of being able to connect with students? I guess like in the campus, now that a lot of us are isolated, we are now unable to really create that one-on-one connection that we used to have. Right now we're just kind of trying to adjust to it. But when learning about where we stand right now politically and the things that we can do as a community together, we're not, always able to motivate other people, right? When we're so interested in these things and we're so focused about what's going around us, how can we get the students and the staff, to really connect with one another and engage them more about the things that we can do and show them the importance of the youth and the power that we have, right? As students, we feel like it's a faculty that have the power, but without the students, the faculty wouldn't be here with us, right? A college campus wouldn't really exist. It wouldn't be a campus without the students. So how can we now be able to move forward with that? If that was too long, please,
Oh, great,
please
great,
tell
great
me now.
question. Great question. The first thing that came to mind was sort of just making real again those same young folks who participated in the civil rights movement. They changed the world. They changed the world. Um, they were young people just like you all. And let me just say a little bit about why. When you get older and you become more entrenched, particularly at that time within the Black community, it was dangerous enough, um, but people were afraid of their jobs. A lot of jobs were tied particularly to caregiving and those types of things for white folks, right? Um, we lived in segregated communities, right? My grandmother taught in one of those one room schoolhouses, right? Who actually dropped out of the pursuit of higher education to teach in that one room schoolhouse, right? So, as communities of color, we have histories of doing what's necessary to take care of ourselves, our family, and our home. If you think about what's happened in the spring and the summer and the protest movement, it was you all. You all were leading the movement for Black Lives. It was a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic proposition. When we first saw Michael Brown and, in response to the killing of George Floyd, there is a change, as leadership now looks like a reflection more of the true being in America, right? So I would say, first of all, welcome that, honor that, and say, you can make a difference. That's one thing. The second thing I'll say, in terms of the person that is a person who spent a lot of his career working in community, now is the time for us to think about both creative ways of engagement, but then also some old school ways of engagement. When I grew up, we didn't have all these mechanisms to be able to be in touch. But if we called for a rally, we still had tons of people who would show up through traditional mechanisms of person to person, phone a friend, um, write somebody, connect in ways in which, those traditional mechanisms of picking up the phone to make sure that we connect with people are still very relevant today. What I would say in terms of the innovation part of it, what makes it more difficult in this climate, it's difficult to account for people's distresses in this climate if they don't, let's say, come to a counseling services, or if they haven't confided in a professor. it's difficult to account for those needs. And so what I think the universities should do, and universities like yours should do, is it's now a different calling for what it's like to be a member of the faculty or staff. We've got to check in. We've got to do some more outreach ourselves. We've got to connect more with our students, and we need to create some spaces that make them feel comfortable, both engaging with us in the university, but then engaging with one another. Then the last thing I'll say is this: you all are the most nimble, the most really in a lot of ways the access to information that your generation has never been experienced before. You all know more about more things than at any point in world history. So you've got the power to be able to do something with that and mobilizing one another to do great things. Just like we're having this, you can start by having these types of things. It doesn't take a lot of people to make a difference. It just takes some people who have similar interests and goals and like minds to be able to move something. And that's as small as something from a student protest on campus to as large as something that becomes the movement for Black lives. You all can do it.
Thank you. That was very inspirational. And I hope that Paula felt a little bit more empowered now to go out and do some, not that she doesn't already do a lot of community work. So I have some questions here. And I think one of them speaks to microaggressions. And of course, microaggressions are about racism. And she says that this person says, in a Hispanic serving institution, it feels insulting when my white colleagues say that they want more diversity in our student population. How would you respond to them? And this is an interesting question, right? Because you went to almost a school that was 99% Black, right? And we are in a Hispanic serving institution. And we struggle with that identity. And I think we still struggle with what it means, right? To be, what is the serving part? What does that mean? So how would you respond to this person?
Very good question. I think you can do both. You can account for who you are and lean into it, celebrate it, say this is who we are and we're proud of it. But you can also attract people of diverse bodies, whether they be race or any other barometer. I also think it's a challenge too for institutions that are heavily centered in religious based formation to think outside, to think, hey, you know what? We probably need Christian organizations, need some Muslim students. We need some people who are Hindu. We need some people who are Sikh, right? Those are other ways in which you can diversify your student population. It just doesn't have to be about race. And it just doesn't have to be about gender either. Of course, we are moving, you all are growing up in a generation where, in 20 years, you may not even be identifying simply as male or female. I mean, we have changed in our society to where gender identification and what you want to be known as and called has changed, right? And so the consciousness and the recognition of that is also, well, we need to be thinking about ways for how we account for diverse representation in those ways as well, right? And we need to allow and create safe spaces for folks to be who they are and to lean into their identities. So there are a myriad of different ways in which we can talk about diversity that don't have to lose sort of the cultural identity of who we are, but can think about, well, what type of world do we want to prepare our students for? And I think that's the critical thing. Are we preparing our students to be global competitors in the world and marketplace? And have we done enough through exposing them to enough difference to ensure that they are going to be able to compete and then come back and bring some of those fruits back to our university.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer and advice. So I have a student here, and she says she's a social work student and recently became interested in the housing crisis.
Mhm.
What are ways that you suggest to start connecting with people that she could work with to make an impact? There's also various questions here about housing and displacement of
Yeah.
people of color, and people are wondering, what are the plans for the what is it, Alazan
Alizon
courts
courts. Okay.
and the
Yeah.
building blocks? What are the plans to hold that are non-existent at this time? So people here are very interested in gentrification, displacement, and how to get involved in remedying the housing crisis.
Good. I'm going to answer the question in a couple ways. One, in terms of generally speaking, our neighborhood housing services um, department is doing a lot of work in trying to ensure that we have strategic housing plan that preserves affordable housing. And when I say preserve, what I'm centering on is trying to keep people in their houses and in neighborhoods that they want to be in, so that they don't lose their homes and their place of being, right? So there's a preservation element that often requires resources for people to maintain their homes, to keep them up in ways in which they won't lose them. And the second part of that is production, where you're talking about how do you build new units, right? Um, there are tons of ways for folks to get involved. There are tons of community groups for people to plug into. I mean, the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center, for example, they are working with neighborhood and housing services all the time. There are folks who are at the Housing Commission. The president of the Housing Commission right now, Jessica Guerrero, is is a huge community advocate and activist, and has been on the front line of work within housing issues for a very long time. One of her central issues was regarding mobile home parks and the ability of people to not be displaced from those mobile home parks, but to also live in conditions that promote and provide the type of dignity that should be associated with quality housing. There are tons of groups that people can plug into. That my recommendation is to contact the policy people in our neighborhood and housing services department, and they can give you some ideas of the list of folks who they can plug into. In terms of some of the specific projects, I don't have all the details on what's happening in terms of specific projects and the Alzon courts, or what some of the folks over at the housing authorities, their purview and their responsibility and the properties that they own are. I don't have all of the information for that, but that's also an entity that people should reach out to, the San Antonio Housing Authority, for some more information. Last thing I'll say real quickly on the housing front, the housing thing, particularly here in San Antonio, is becoming a huge sort of, there's an economic imperative that we have quality, affordable housing, period. And so anti-gentrification efforts and displacement efforts are something that are all a part of the policy agenda for the city. The mayor, the city manager, all those folks, city council members are adamant about it, and they put a lot of resources in terms of trying to ensure that we preserve and protect affordable housing opportunity.
So I guess our job now is to hold them accountable, right, to
Absolutely,
those plans.
100%. Like,
Right.
show up to the meetings, go to the, I mean, city council meetings were good examples of that. Show up to the housing commission meetings so that you can get informed about what's happening, and exercise your advocacy orientation that way. All of that information you can find on the city's website. They are meeting virtually. And so there are public participation mechanisms for people to be able to participate, though.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
Dr. Martinez, you have a very large question. I'm going to unmute you if you're still with us so you can ask your question. Are you there,
Yeah,
Dr. Martinez?
sure. I'm sorry. Thank you.
It was just a huge treatise,
Yeah,
so I
I know.
thought
I'm
maybe.
sorry. I was like, should I be unmuted or leave? And I tried to type it out. I'm so sorry, but thank you so much for this discussion. This was absolutely amazing. So, okay, here it is, okay? So my question is centers around the language that we use when describing these movements, okay? So here I was thinking of how, or I was thinking of Dr. Pino Joseph's, most recent book, The Sword and the Shield, right? And how he is really trying to interrogate this usage of like nonviolence versus violence, right? Just try to break this binary, just break this dichotomy, right? So we see how, again, especially here in the news lately, we see that, these nonviolent protests are pitted against more, quote, militant or, quote, radical ways of protesting, right? And we see how, we see how these have been kind of pitted against each other, and again, how folks are now interrogating that dichotomy. So my question is, what are the words that we should be using or interrogating, right, and describing the various forms that people protest against injustice? And also, if we have time, if you could kind of speak about how certain terms themselves have been racialized, right? We see riots equals Black Lives Matter, and we see Capitol stormers equals patriots, right? So, if you could speak to a couple of those different things. I know we're, kind of cutting close on time, but I appreciate you, and thank you so much again for being here at LU. Mr. Butler,
Thank
thank you.
No, I appreciate the question. I'm an English major, and so one of the things I'm very sensitive to is number one, words matter, but number two, language changes. I'm old enough to remember when queer, for example, was looked at as a very negative term. It has been changed in its canonization by people who have reclaimed the term and made it something affirming. So language changes. I just want to say that. And I think that we as people, and something connecting to that, the seed of some of the earlier questions about what is collaborative problem solving? What is participatory governance? I think those types of things are central to people's reclamation in some instances or their creations in terminology. Now, back to the more specifics of your question around sort of um, racializing language associated with terminology. Here's the thing. The Black Lives Matters protesters were never simply called nonviolent protesters, in large part, because you had people who insisted on saying they're rioters, they're this, they're that, making it very negative. It didn't even give the actual sort of real-time value to the fact that these were nonviolent peaceful protests, right? There were elements that happened that were not associated with any other protest that turned violent. And I'm specifically talking about the riots that would have been in association with the killings of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or any of those other things. The second thing I will say is oftentimes the provocation, the ways in which we respond to things provoke and promote certain ways of describing them. Okay. So it's undeniable in the examples of civil rights protesters that as they walked across a bridge, they were attacked. Okay. But to think about Black people now in this context, Black and brown people protesting now, they're already greeted and met with militarized presence, highly policed, over policed, militaristic type of presence that invokes for people some sense of conflict. And so what do they do then? Oh, rioters in attachment, all right? Now, when the rioters really happened in the insurrection that happened on January 6th in the Capitol, I searched news media for them to describe them as rioters. All right. There was no militaristic presence around them, no significant law enforcement presence around them. And it's not until later that they actually stormed the Capitol that people called them what they were, insurrectionists. Okay. And so I think language is extraordinarily important, and it helps us think in our minds, consciously and unconsciously, of what we think about people. I think a lot of that has to do with bias. It has to do with, there is a contrast too. In the civil rights movement, they were purposeful in making sure they were dressed in suits and ties and their Sunday best, for example, to not create some of the tensions associated with how people just look at people of color, right? You know, you see a black guy walking across the street and he might have his hair in locks, and you automatically think negative things oftentimes about him. And what happens is people then attach those negative language to it. And so, I mean, that's a long way of kind of getting to the heart of your question, Dr. Martinez, but I think in large part, we have to be conscious of the ways in which media defines things, people, images, and we as people working to dismantle that, we have to call it when we see it. And fortunately, the reason the hope part of me, the person that sits here with you today that is filled with hope, thinks about the fact that we actually had a president in an inaugural address call out white supremacy and call out white nationalistic behavior, right? We hadn't had that before. People's language and how they're talking about it and how they're talking about racial equity and social equity is also changing. That is a plus. Today, we're having this conversation. The Biden administration has declared this Racial Equity Day, and we're having this conversation, right? We had a Black president who couldn't be affirmed enough to be able to say, hey, we're going to have something on a Racial Equity Day. People would have they would have lost their minds. You know what I mean? And so I think for us as being people who are interested in how we effectuate movements in people, their lives, their hearts, their minds, you know, we got to call it what it is first, and then you can have the reconciliation moment of moving beyond it once you identify it.
Wow, thank you for that. That was a wonderful way to end our program today because we're a little bit over time. And wow, we were so prescient. We predicted the future, that today would be the conversation for equity, and we have our event today. That's great. Well, I just wanted to thank you again for your time, for your presence, for your intellect and knowledge, and for sharing all of that with our students today. We had a few problems with the staging of the event, but it's recorded. So I will post this recording to Facebook because we only have half the recording on Facebook, but I will repost for those of you who want to watch it later. And we hope that we can invite you again to Olu to do some workshops with us or meet with students. It was wonderful to have you. Thank you.
Would love it. Thank you all so much.
Bye.